Hey there. Tonight, we're going far back.
The Civil War's deepest battles weren't fought at Gettysburg. They were fought in the soul. Meet Elias Thorne, a scholar trapped in a Confederate uniform he despises, bound by one terrible choice: saving his Union-sympathizing wife. He traded his identity for a lie, and that lie cost 3 young men their lives. Now, the price of his survival is guilt. His quest for neutral ground ends at Shiloh. He's a cartographer who killed with a map, and he's about to draw the final, deadly line.
If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace.
The air over Harper's Ferry was not just cold, it was wet, carrying the heavy, metallic scent of the river and the sharper, less tangible tang of fear. It clung to the stone walls of the armory and settled deep in the lungs of Elias Thorne. He stood by the window of the upstairs study, his back to the meager heat of the hearth, watching the gray pre-dawn crawl over the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. It was October 16th, 1859, and the dawn was a lie, a pale, weak wash of color that promised nothing but another day of rising tensions. Elias was a cartographer by trade, a man who dealt in lines of latitude and longitude, in the certainty of measured space. Yet lately, the map of his own life had begun to dissolve into a confusing, swirling fog. The study was his father's, filled with the comforting smell of aged leather and pipe smoke, but it offered no comfort now. Below, in the town, the silence was too deep for an hour before workers were due to report to the Federal Armory. It was the silence of held breath. He ran a thumb over the worn edge of a ledger on the desk, not a mapping book, but one of his father's personal journals. The last entry was stark, written in a hand less steady than usual. The center will not hold. We stand between the thunder and the storm. Elias had been trying to reconcile his father's philosophical anguish with the simple, hard reality of his own life. He was not a firebrand abolitionist, nor was he a defender of the peculiar institution that shadowed the South. He was, disastrously, a man of the border, a resident of a town perched precariously between two worlds, Maryland and Virginia, North and South, freedom and bondage. His central conflict was his own loyalty, split down the middle like the river junction he could see from the window. His mother's family were staunch Northern Quakers, steeped in quiet, unyielding opposition to slavery. His wife, Clara, however, hailed from an old Shenandoah family, whose wealth, though modest, was built on the fertile land and the labor of enslaved people. Their marriage, once a testament to hope and compromise, now felt like a fragile, crumbling treaty. Just 2 days ago, Clara had received a letter from her cousin Samuel, a hot-headed Virginian lawyer who had recently embraced the militant Southern cause. The letter, left open on the kitchen table, had contained a chilling sentence. "The North is preparing to ignite a war, Elias. We must be prepared to defend our way of life, to draw a line in the soil itself." Draw the line, Elias thought, gripping the windowsill. His life was drawing the line, and now the line was drawing him. A sharp, irregular sound cut through the silence below. Not a gunshot, but a sound of splintering wood and shouted confusion. It was followed by the unmistakable, jarring ring of the armory bell, pulled frantically, alarmingly. Elias straightened, the academic fog of his thoughts instantly evaporating. Something had broken the truce of the night. He turned, grabbing his father's old, heavy fowling piece from the wall rack. The smell of powder and grease was raw and real, a counterpoint to the intellectual discussions of the past years. Clara, wrapped in a linen nightgown, appeared silently in the doorway, her auburn hair loose over her shoulders, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. "Elias, what is that?" she whispered, her voice strained. "I don't know," he said, slinging the strap of the rifle over his shoulder. "But it's not a fire, Clara. It's an alarm. Stay here. Bar the door." He hesitated, seeing the plea and the terror in her face. The protagonist's initial state: a man of reason caught in a situation demanding action, his most precious personal relationship now threatened by external seismic events. "Be safe, Elias," she said, her hands coming up to grip the frame of the door. He did not reply with promises, only with a decisive nod. He knew, with a sudden, devastating clarity, that the time for maps, treaties, and reasoned debate was over. The promise of an easy, peaceful dawn in America was not just fading, it had been violently shattered. He descended the stairs, not as the scholar or the moderate, but as a man about to step into a darkness he had only ever charted from afar. Whatever was happening in the town below, a slave revolt, an insurrection, an invasion, it was the beginning of the storm his father had forewarned, and he was standing directly in the path. Elias Thorne stepped out onto the narrow cobblestone lane, the cold air immediately seizing his lungs. The armory bell continued its frantic, irregular tolling, a metallic scream against the stillness. The sound was not a call to community, but a raw, panicked alert. He moved quickly, clutching the old fowling piece, its weight oddly comforting. His heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs that matched the frantic clanging. The streets of Harper's Ferry, usually bustling even before full light, were deserted. Shutters were drawn tight. The town felt like a stage set awaiting a terrible drama. Rounding the corner by the paymaster's house, Elias came upon the first visible evidence of the turmoil: a shattered window and a pool of dark, fresh blood staining the pristine white porch steps. Beside it, a discarded, oddly shaped pike lay on the ground, a weapon of medieval simplicity, disturbingly out of place in this modern industrial town. This is not a local quarrel, he realized, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical blow. This is organized. A voice, low and urgent, hissed from the shadow of a livery stable. "Thorne, get down!" Elias dropped instantly, the rough stone biting into his knee. He looked up to see Mr. Silas Hemlock, the town's elderly, nervous constable, huddled behind an overturned wagon, his face a mask of terror. "Silas, what in God's name is happening?" Elias demanded. Hemlock pointed a trembling finger toward the armory gate, now barely visible through the swirling mist. "Insurrection, Elias. They're fanatics. They seized the engine house and the armory offices. They cut the telegraph lines. We're isolated." Who are they?" "Abolitionists, they say, led by John Brown." The name landed like a stone in Elias's gut. John Brown, the bloody Kansas crusader, a man notorious for his violent, uncompromising zeal. The seed of disquiet, planted by whispers and letters, now sprouted into a terrifying reality. "They've taken hostages," Hemlock stammered, his eyes wide, "including Colonel Lewis Washington and several of the armory staff." The situation was instantly clarified, and with it, Elias's moral position was thrown into agonizing turmoil. This was not a theoretical debate about states' rights. This was an armed invasion of federal property, resulting in bloodshed right in his backyard. My duty is to the town, to order, the cartographer in him clinging to the rules of civility. He rose slightly, adjusting his grip on a rifle. "We have to organize a defense, Silas. Gather the townspeople who have weapons. We can't wait for aid." But before he could move, a dark, fast-moving figure darted from the shadows near the armory gate. He was a powerfully built man, wearing rough, homespun clothing and carrying a rifle and one of those terrifying pikes. "Stop! Halt in the name of the United States government!" Hemlock yelled, his voice cracking from fear. The man ignored him, disappearing behind the post office. It was then Elias saw it. Not the man, but what he was carrying. A large leather satchel, stuffed so full the seams looked ready to burst. The memory of his father's ledger and the recent discussions about the armory's stores flashed in Elias's mind. They didn't just want the building, they wanted the weapons. He looked back at the terrified constable. "Silas, that man just stole something crucial. I'm going after him. You go gather the men. Focus on the armory gate."
Without waiting for a reply, Elias took off, running not toward the main conflict at the engine house, but after the retreating figure. He knew this part of the town better than anyone, the maze of back alleys, the steep paths up the ridge. The chase led him past the Thorne family's own small cottage. He skidded to a stop, his gaze drawn to the front porch. The door was still barred, but resting against the stone railing was a small, smooth river stone, a signaling stone that Clara's Shenandoah family used to communicate distress or warning, known only to their close kin. Clara, his wife, had left the signal. Elias's chest tightened. Why was she signaling? Was she in danger, or was it a warning about the man he was chasing? He had to make a split-second decision, his immediate duty to the public good, catching the thief, versus the private, desperate plea of his wife. The thud of the running man's boots echoed faintly from the direction of the upper town, heading toward the steep, winding road that led to the countryside, and, incidentally, toward Clara's cousin Samuel's estate, the very man who had warned of war. This is the disruptor, Elias thought. No longer about the gun or the town. It's about the satchel, and what Clara knows. He pushed past his house, his heart aching, the smooth river stone acting as the final agonizing twist of the knife. The fight was no longer outside. It had invaded the very foundation of his marriage. The promise of Dawn was truly broken. He was pursuing a shadow, now aware that the deepest conspiracy might lie closer to home than the armory gates. The chase led Elias Thorne up the steep, winding road known as Ridge Path, away from the chaos of the armory, and into the pre-dawn silence of the hills. The man with the satchel was quick, but Elias, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need for answers about Clara's signal, managed to keep him in sight. He cornered the figure just as the path opened onto a small, overgrown clearing, often used by hunters. The man, sweating and panting, stumbled, dropping the heavy leather satchel. It skidded across the damp leaves, its contents thudding dully. "Stop right there," Elias ordered, leveling the fowling piece. The barrel was steady despite his hammering heart. The man slowly turned. He was younger than Elias had first thought, perhaps 25, his face grimed with soot and fear, but his eyes held a fanatical, unyielding glint. He nor wore a uniform, but his rough coat was riddled with holes, suggesting a long, hard journey. "I am not a thief, Virginian," he rasped, his accent clearly New England. "I am here for God's justice. The weapons belong to the people, not the oppressors. They belong to the U.S. government. And that satchel, what does it contain?"
The man didn't answer, merely shifted his weight, his hand inching toward the long, brutal pike leaning against a nearby tree. "If you move, I will shoot. Tell me your name and why you were taking federal property." "My name is Jedediah," he said, his voice rising in fervent righteousness. "And I carry the evidence of our purpose, the plans to arm those who have known only chains." As Jedediah spoke, his fanaticism overriding his caution, he made his move, not toward the pike, but a sudden lunge for the satchel. Elias reacted instantly. He fired. The sound of the fowling piece ripped through the quiet hills. It wasn't aimed at the man's chest. Elias was a cartographer, not a killer, but at his leg. Jedediah cried out, staggering, clutching his thigh where the shot had torn through the fabric, drawing a sickening rush of blood. The man collapsed beside the satchel, his zealous glare now replaced by pure agony. Elias rushed forward, kicked the pike away, and knelt beside the leather bag. He unbuckled the straps, his hands trembling slightly. He expected powder and lead. Instead, he found a tightly bound stack of documents, meticulously drawn maps of the surrounding counties, detailed blueprints of local plantations, and, most chillingly, a roster of names of the enslaved people in the valley, cross-referenced with their locations and the coded phrases for the planned rebellion. But beneath the revolutionary papers was a single, sealed envelope of thick cream paper addressed in Clara's graceful script to her cousin, Samuel Pritchard. Elias stared at it, the blood draining from his face. Clara.
The crossroads was no longer about North versus South, abolitionist versus enslaver. It was about Elias versus his wife, reason versus blood, and the secret knowledge that could destroy their marriage and perhaps condemn an entire family. Jedediah, pale and weak, watched him with feverish eyes. "You have the papers now. You have seen the truth. You are no better than the tyrants if you silence it." Elias stood, his mind reeling. Choice A, the cartographer, allegiance to order and justice. Turn Jedediah over to the authorities along with the satchel. The plans for the broader uprising would be revealed, Brown's raid would be fully understood, and federal order would be restored. But Clara's treason, her connection, however unwilling, to the South's covert resistance through her cousin, would be exposed, likely leading to her arrest and the utter destruction of his life. Choice B, the husband, allegiance to love and kin. Destroy the envelope addressed to Samuel. Treat Jedediah's wound and leave him to be found, framing the incident as a simple struggle over the stolen armory documents. The immediate threat to Clara would be neutralized, but Elias would be complicit in concealing the South's organized response and the truth of the larger conspiracy. He would have irrevocably committed himself to his wife's side of the border. He looked down at the blood-stained satchel, at the envelope with Clara's careful, loving handwriting. He could not, would not, condemn her. The war had not yet begun, and he had to save the one thing he had left. With a deep, painful certainty, Elias populated the envelope addressed to Samuel. He carefully gathered the abolitionist documents, leaving only the bloodied satchel behind. He then swiftly fashioned a makeshift tourniquet for Jedediah, his hands moving with practiced speed. "I am taking your maps, Jedediah," Elias said, his voice low and hard. "I am not taking you to the authorities, but you need to tell me one thing, the truth. How did you get this envelope from my wife?" Jedediah, though wounded, managed a weak, knowing smile. "The line, Virginian, is not where you draw it on your paper. The river flows both ways. She knew we were coming. She was warning her people." She was warning her people. The words were a fatal judgment. Elias had made his choice. He had betrayed the federal order, concealed a conspiracy, and stepped firmly onto the path of the South, all to protect his wife. The crossroads was crossed, and the path ahead was dark and uncharted. He now held secrets that would make him an enemy of the very order he had sworn to uphold. Elias returned to his cottage under the shadow of the morning, no longer merely the town cartographer, but a man burdened by conspiracy and compromise. The armory bell had mercifully ceased its clamor, replaced by the shouts of local militias gathering and the distant rhythmic hoofbeats of cavalry. Federal troops were finally arriving. The world was catching up, and Elias and Clara needed to be miles ahead. He found Clara exactly where he had left her, sitting rigid on the bottom step of the staircase, her pale face illuminated by the weak light filtering through the kitchen window. The river stone, her silent distress signal, was gone from the porch. "It was John Brown," Elias said, his voice flat, bypassing any greeting. He didn't ask about the envelope for Samuel or the warning signal. The time for questions was past. The time for action was now. Clara simply nodded, her eyes confirming everything he had suspected. They will be sending riders today. They need to know what he intended to do. She was referring to her family, to the Southern cause. "I know," Elias replied, pulling the satchel of abolitionist documents from under his coat. "I have secured these, and I have made my choice." He went to the small, discreet safe his father had built into the study wall, retrieving a handful of gold eagles and 2 well-worn deeds. Then he gathered only the essentials: warm blankets,
a small bag of dried rations, and his compass, the one piece of certainty left in his life. Clara, moving with a sudden purposeful energy that belied her terror, was already packing their few family heirlooms and her necessary medicines into a carpet bag. She spoke as she worked, her voice low and steady. "My family knew this day was coming, Elias. Not Brown specifically, but an act of aggression. They expected Virginia to be the first target." "Did you send that envelope to Samuel?" Elias asked, the question escaping despite his vow of silence. Clara paused, her back to him. "I needed to warn my people, Elias. They are not villains. They are men and women trying to protect their home and their way of life, just as you are protecting yours now." The answer wasn't a confession of treason, but a declaration of loyalty. A loyalty that ran deeper than his own. Elias accepted it. He was now an accessory to that loyalty. Within the hour they were ready. The town was sealed off, swarming with official uniforms. They had to leave on foot, using the back paths Elias had mapped years ago for local hunters. Their transition began not with a grand escape, but with a scramble through the damp, tangled undergrowth behind their small garden shed. They moved silently, two figures shedding their comfortable, ordered life with every footstep. They bypassed the main roads and headed south, following the rugged spine of Elk Ridge, the armory and the town of Harper's Ferry shrinking behind them until it was just a smudge of stone and smoke on the horizon. The journey was a brutal initiation. They walked for hours, fear their constant companion. The path was uneven, and the cold air turned into a biting wind as they climbed higher. Elias, the man of books, found himself suddenly dependent on raw physical endurance. They stopped at midday on a high, exposed crest. Below them, stretching into the distance, was the Shenandoah Valley, the heart of the old Virginian gentry, Clara's ancestral home, and now what would soon become the crucible of the war. In the near distance, Elias saw the first tangible evidence of the historical event they were fleeing into. A plume of thick, oily, black smoke rising from a distant farmstead. It was not a chimney fire. "What is that?" Clara whispered, clutching his arm, her eyes wide with dread. Elias lowered the fowling piece, scanning the horizon. "That, Clara, is the fire of fear. A retaliatory strike. Either a federal response burning out Brown's sympathizers or local slave owners making an example." The burnt fields, the war, they had tried to map out and discuss politely in drawing rooms, had arrived, crude and savage. The journey was over, the conflict had begun. They had successfully transitioned from the periphery of the event to its beating, violent heart. They were refugees now, no longer citizens. Elias led them down the far side of the ridge, away from the smoke, toward the familiar but now dangerous territory of Clara's cousin, Samuel Pritchard. He needed to deliver the envelope, to complete the act of commitment he had chosen on the ridge path.
He no longer sought order. He sought survival, guided only by the loyalty he owed to the one person who mattered. The sun dipped low, casting long, fractured shadows as Elias and Clara finally reached the outskirts of the Pritchard estate. Oak Hill, Clara's ancestral home, was not the grand plantation of popular imagination, but a sturdy, sprawling farmstead of brick and white columns, surrounded by vast acreage of ripening corn and, crucially, a thick border of dense pine forest. Elias bypassed the main entrance. He knew Samuel Pritchard, Clara's cousin, was a man who preferred to receive sensitive information away from the eyes of servants and any casual observer. They followed a barely visible deer trail leading to a small, isolated clearing deep within the pines, a spot Clara had described as Samuel's preferred parliament.
The air here was sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. They hadn't waited long before the sound of horses approached. Not a large company, but 3 riders. Samuel Pritchard dismounted first. He was a man in his mid-30s, handsome but severe, his lawyer's suit replaced by riding boots and a homespun coat. He greeted Clara with a brief, affectionate embrace. His attention immediately shifted to Elias. "Thorn, I did not expect you to be the one to deliver the message," Samuel said, his eyes shrewd and assessing. The 2 men had always maintained a cool, polite distance, one rooted in their opposing political leanings. Elias ignored the implied accusation and handed over the cream-colored envelope Clara had left on their porch. "This is from Clara. It was intercepted by one of Brown's men. I recovered it." Samuel's eyes widened slightly in recognition of the thick, quality paper. He broke the seal and read the short note inside. It was not a grand missive of treason, but a concise, coded warning about the date and probable target of the raid, gathered from overheard conversations among Elias's northern sympathizing contacts. "A remarkable piece of intelligence, cousin," Samuel murmured, folding the note away. He looked at Elias, a new respect, though tinged with suspicion, entering his gaze. "You risked a great deal for this." "I risked it for my wife," Elias corrected him sharply, "and for the truth." Samuel nodded, accepting the boundary. "The truth, yes. Brown's fanatics may be contained at Harper's Ferry, but the damage is done. They have shown the North's hand. We must be ready to show ours." Samuel signaled to the 2 men who had accompanied him. One was a local magistrate, the other a former Confederate colonel from the Mexican-American War. Men of influence and action. "Elias, you have the maps, don't you? The ones you recovered from the man you shot on the ridge path?" Elias reached into his coat and produced the roll of papers. The detailed maps of local plantations and the list of enslaved people Brown intended to arm. He had risked everything to keep these out of federal hands. The magistrate gasped, seeing the clear danger. Good Lord, the detail! Had this fallen into the wrong hands, the valley would have been engulfed in blood. This was the crucial piece of information, the moment of covert action. Elias had provided the Southern cause with undeniable proof of the magnitude of the abolitionist conspiracy, validating Samuel's warnings and justifying their preparations. Samuel spread the maps out on a fallen log, illuminating them with a shielded lantern. This changes everything. We are no longer defending against an attack. We are defending against a highly organized insurrection. Elias, you are a cartographer. You understand terrain better than any of us. These maps were drawn by an outsider, an amateur. We need to counter-map them. We need to know where our forces can best cut off any future attempts to rally those lists of names. He handed Elias a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. Your neutrality is gone, Thorn. You saved my family's life and our cause with your silence and your actions today. Now commit to the next step. Where is the best choke point to defend this valley? Draw the line, Elias, for Virginia. Elias Thorn, the man who dealt in the certainty of lines, stood in the dark, smelling the pine and the fear. The choice he had made on the ridge path was now formalized. He was being asked to weaponize his skill to draw the battle lines for the South. He took the pencil. His fingers, trained for years to trace boundaries of peace, now moved to mark potential ambushes and troop movements. His entry into the heart of the conflict was complete, finalized by a whisper in the dark and the damning lines he drew on the map of war. 6 months bled into the spring of 1860. The fear generated by John Brown's raid had solidified into a chilling political reality. Elias and Clara remained at Oak Hill, caught in the accelerating vortex of secessionist fervor. Elias's mapping skills, once instruments of peaceful knowledge, were now entirely devoted to defense planning for the valley, marking potential invasion routes for what Samuel Pritchard called Lincoln's impending war.
Elias was a spy of necessity, a cartographer turned operative. His days were spent drawing trenches, identifying strategic river crossings, and secretly meeting with local militia leaders. Yet every line he drew felt like a chain tightening around his own neck. He was a man with a northern soul, drawing maps for a southern cause, all to protect the woman he loved. The true moment of his commitment, the one that fully shattered his lingering illusion of neutrality, arrived unexpectedly in May. A small contingent of Virginia troops, wearing the newly authorized, somewhat haphazard, gray and yellow uniforms of the local militia, arrived at Oak Hill. Samuel brought out Elias to meet their commander, a stern, weather-beaten Captain Vance. "Captain Vance needs a cartographer for the new mobilization efforts," Samuel announced, placing a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "He's here to finalize your papers, Elias. You will be formally inducted into the Virginia forces." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Formal induction? "Samuel, my role was to provide intelligence and maps. I'm not a soldier." "You are now, Elias," he corrected, his voice hardening with the authority of the moment. "Your usefulness as a civilian informant is exhausted. The Union is mobilizing. We need our people in the structure. We can't have a valuable asset wandering around without papers, liable to be misunderstood for a deserter or a spy." Captain Vance presented the official document, a plain sheet detailing his assignment. Below his name, the title read, "Field Cartographer, Provisional Virginia Army." Elias stared at the paper. It was his final terrifying loss of innocence. He would no longer be marking routes from the safety of a study. He would be officially wearing the colors of a seceding state, preparing for combat. "I need to speak with my wife," he managed, his voice hoarse. Clara was waiting in the hallway. When he showed her the paper, her eyes filled not with relief that he was protected, but with a profound, sudden sorrow. "They will give you a uniform," she whispered, her hands grasping his. "Elias, I never wanted this. I wanted your protection, not your soul. My soul was lost the moment I chose my home over my conviction," he replied, the bitterness sharp. "They are giving me the gray. I just hope the color doesn't run." The following morning, the uniform was delivered, not the crisp gray of the later Confederacy, but a darker, cheaper, almost blue-gray tunic and trousers, hastily manufactured from local materials. He put it on in the privacy of their bedroom. The coarse wool was itchy and smelled of dye and storage. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see himself, Elias Thorne, the methodical scholar. He saw a nameless combatant, a man whose identity had been erased by the demands of allegiance. He felt the literal weight of the uniform, the heavy material, the uncomfortable fit, and the unbearable moral burden it represented. He had chosen to save Clara, and in doing so had traded his identity for a desperate necessity. He had pledged his hands, his mind, and his life to a cause he did not fully believe in. When he stepped out, Clara looked at him, and tears finally spilled onto her cheeks. "You look like a ghost," she murmured. "A ghost in the machine, my dear," he replied, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I can map the machine, but I can no longer stop its turning."
The burden of duty, a duty forced upon him by self-preservation, was crushing. The blue-gray uniform was a shroud over his former life. His struggle was no longer external, it was internal. A deep-seated battle between the man who'd measured the world and the soldier who was now compelled to destroy it. Elias Thorne's new existence began not with the glory of battle, but with the grim reality of logistics and intimidation. His first official deployment was with Captain Vance's company, tasked with securing supplies in the borderlands, a euphemism for the confiscation of property from known Union loyalists. The moral strain of wearing the ill-fitting blue-gray uniform reached a breaking point during a raid on the farm of old Mr. Jeremiah Holt, a staunchly pro-Union German immigrant known for his abundant grain stores.
It was a cold, bright morning, a week after Elias donned his uniform. They found Holt sitting stubbornly on his porch, a shotgun across his knees. Vance, a man of brutal efficiency, quickly disarmed him. "We need your winter stores, Holt," Vance snarled, his eyes scanning the barn. "The army will compensate you, eventually." "Compensation from traitors is worthless," Holt spat, his voice trembling more from anger than fear. "Take your thieving hands off my livelihood." Elias stood apart, his role supposedly to map the inventory, but his heart ached with the injustice. This was not the grand defense of Virginia. This was legalized theft, and he was the unwilling accomplice. As the men began loading wagons with sacks of wheat and preserved meats, Elias noticed a small, desperate act. Mrs. Holt, tears streaming down her face, was attempting to hide a large, leather-bound family Bible under a pile of straw in the corner of the smokehouse. Inside the Bible, Elias knew, would be their saved cash and perhaps deeds, everything they needed to rebuild. He glanced at Captain Vance, who was preoccupied shouting orders. Elias took a deep breath, recognizing this as his moment, a small, necessary act of moral resistance. He moved toward the smokehouse, pencil and notepad in hand, pretending to tally the remaining hams. He caught Mrs. Holt's eye, a brief moment of connection between a man with a weapon and a woman who had lost everything. "I need to check the inventory in this corner, ma'am," Elias said, his voice loud enough for the nearby soldiers to hear, but his gaze conveying a different message entirely. He knelt down, casually kicking the straw aside. He didn't touch the Bible. Instead, he pulled out a small, half-full tin of imported English tea, a rare luxury in these parts. "Captain," Elias called out, holding up the tin, "Holt had some imported goods. Should I include this in the manifest?" "Tea? Leave it, Thorne. We don't need foreign trifles. Quebec the grain tally." Elias nodded, but his movement hit a crucial diversion. As Vance looked away, Elias slid the tin of tea into the corner where the Bible was hidden, effectively marking the spot. He gave Mrs. Holt a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod. The silent message was clear: wait for the tea, and you have the spot. Later that evening, after the company had moved on to set up camp in a pine grove, Elias found his opportunity to complete his compromise. The night was damp and miserable. Vance was negotiating with a local sutler, the military merchant who followed the troops, selling essentials and luxuries at exorbitant prices. The sutler, a greasy-haired man named Gideon, was offering Vance a bottle of French brandy for the unmanifested spoils of the day's raid. Elias watched the transaction, the cynical sutler's bargain playing out. Stolen goods exchanged for private comfort. This was the true face of their cause: profit and corruption. He approached Vance when the deal was done. "Captain," Elias said, his voice deliberately measured, "I found something else at Holt's. Not worth adding to the manifest, but perhaps more worth to a discreet buyer." "More luxury trifles, Thorne?" Vance raised a skeptical eyebrow. Elias pulled a tightly rolled blueprint from his inner coat pocket, one of the detailed maps he had recovered from John Brown's accomplice, Jedediah. He had added several convincing but utterly false strategic markings to it. "This is a copy of a Union Scouts map," Elias lied smoothly. "It details a rumored supply depot near Winchester. It's fresh intelligence, but perhaps too risky for us to act on right now. Gideon might pay a handsome sum for it, either to sell it back to a Union contact or to use it to plan his own market routes." Vance's eyes gleamed with greed. He didn't care about the map's authenticity. He cared only about the immediate cash. The subsequent exchange was quick. Gideon, believing he had acquired valuable northern intelligence, paid Vance a handful of silver dollars. Elias, however, had one condition for his discovery. He took a small, unmarked portion of the money, enough to buy some real medicine for Clara, whose constitution was suffering in the harsh conditions at Oak Hill. Elias had crossed a new boundary. He had used his intelligence and his uniform not to defend Virginia, but to engage in a calculated act of deception and black market opportunism. He had sold a lie to a profiteer, secured a small financial reward for himself, and crucially protected the Holt's future by his silence. He returned to his lonely, cold tent, the coins heavy in his pocket.
The survival of his wife and the small, fleeting act of justice for the Holts had cost him another piece of his moral self. The weight of the blue-gray uniform was heavier than ever, now soiled not just by politics, but by the grime of a necessary corruption. The false map Elias had sold to the sutler, Gideon, was intended to be a harmless deception, a way to pocket some silver and protect a Union family. Instead, it became the catalyst for disaster. Gideon, driven by greed, sold the Union intelligence to a small, isolated detachment of Virginia Scouts. Acting on the fabricated coordinates, the Scouts rode directly into a well-placed federal picket line outside Winchester. The resulting skirmish was brief but brutal. 3 young men were killed and 2 captured, all casualties of Elias's calculated lie. The news reached Captain Vance's company 2 days before Christmas 1860. The onset of winter was harsh, the landscape frozen solid, mirroring the cold dread that settled in Elias's heart. He stood alone, shivering inside his blue-gray uniform as Vance read the official report of the Winchester tragedy.
3 good boys, Thorne. Killed because some damn fool thought he had a shortcut, Vance grumbled, never suspecting Elias's role. He only saw the immediate cause, the treachery of the black market. Elias had felt shame before, but this was different. This was guilt, cold, hard, and corrosive. His attempt at a small moral victory had caused real death. He was no longer just compromised, he was stained. This was the lowest point of his moral trajectory. The guilt was compounded by physical hardship. The winter was merciless. Rations were scarce, consisting mainly of hardtack and weak coffee. The company was constantly moving, attempting to outmaneuver the now highly mobilized federal forces. Elias, weakened by lack of sleep and the internal war he fought daily, fell prey to a virulent fever.
His body surrendered to the chill in early January. He collapsed during a march, waking up days later in a makeshift field hospital, a damp, drafty barn near the town of Manassas. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, pine needles, and the cloying sweetness of gangrene. He was delirious for days, slipping in and out of consciousness. In his fever dreams, he saw the faces of the 3 dead scouts, their blood on the map he had drawn. He saw Clara's eyes, accusing him not of treason, but of self-deception. When the fever broke, he was profoundly weak. A young, inexperienced doctor pressed a piece of stale bread into his hand. "You're lucky, soldier," the doctor muttered, scraping frost from the inside of the barn wall. "Most who get the fever don't see the spring. You'll have a scar to remind you, though." Elias raised a trembling hand to his left cheek. The fever had left its physical mark, a jagged, reddish patch of skin, sensitive and raw, running from his temple to his jawline, a permanent brand, his own personal midwinter's scar. His physical recovery was slow and incomplete. He was no longer just the sickly cartographer. He was the scarred cartographer, marked by both a moral and physical flaw. The true defeat, however, came during his convalescence. While he was recovering, a major, unexpected movement of federal troops occurred along the Potomac. Vance's company, utilizing one of Elias's old, outdated maps that hadn't accounted for the latest troop deployments, was caught in a surprise encirclement. They lost half their men, their wagons, and their best cannon. It was a major defeat for that small section of the Provisional Army. When Vance finally found him, the captain's face was etched with defeat and rage. "Your maps, Thorne," Vance spat, leaning over his cot. "The old maps you drew for Samuel. They were based on old river levels. The Yankees used a crossing you swore was too deep. We lost good men, and all we have to show for it is the mud on our boots." Elias could only stare at the barn ceiling, too weak to defend his old outdated work. The tools of his former trade, his lines, his calculations, his very methods, had turned against him, resulting in defeat and death. He was a failed husband, a failed soldier, and a failed cartographer. He carried the guilt of 3 young men he killed with a lie, and the responsibility for a dozen more lost by his out-of-date truth. Lying there in the darkness, feeling the throbbing burn of the scar on his face, Elias realized he was completely isolated. The North viewed him as a traitor. The South viewed him as a flawed asset, his work unreliable. And Clara, though protected, was emotionally distant. His only companions were the specters of the dead and the bitter cold of a war that had just begun. Elias Thorne was discharged from the Manassas Field Hospital in late January 1861, his face bearing the permanent reddish brand of the fever, his midwinter scar. He was officially reassigned, not back to Captain Vance's company, but to a logistics outpost near Leesburg, closer to the Potomac border. His orders were simple: use his expertise to verify and update old military boundary maps, ensuring future troop movements would not repeat the costly errors of the past. The work was tedious and solitary, spent poring over brittle, decade-old land surveys. It was in this cold isolation that Elias began to truly confront the cumulative weight of his choices. He was paid in depreciated Confederate currency, haunted by the dead, and separated from Clara, who remained at Oak Hill, guarded by Samuel. The turning point came one desolate afternoon, while Elias was cross-referencing a 1785 French survey with a recent crudely drawn Confederate sketch of the Potomac's riverbanks. The sketch, intended to show a secure crossing point for future raids into Maryland, was marked with a precise measurement for the river's depth, 4 feet. He frowned, pulling out his own meticulous river soundings taken years earlier for a commercial project. The Potomac's currents were notoriously fickle, constantly shifting the sediment. A depth of 4 feet in summer could easily be 6 or 7 feet in the thaw of spring. He flipped the sketch over, and his breath hitched. Scrawled on the back in faint pencil were a series of initials and dates. Among them were the initials SP, Samuel Pritchard, and a date from late December, followed by the single word, assured. A cold, sharp clarity cut through the fever-induced fog of Elias's guilt. The realization hit him that Samuel hadn't simply asked him to draw better maps. He had used the outdated map mistake not as a justification for a tactical error, but as a deliberate shield. The Union pickets that annihilated Vance's company had been alerted by Samuel. The mistake was a calculated sacrifice of Vance's men, all expendable border militia, to protect a more vital intelligence operation. Samuel was clearing his own field of play. Elias had been so focused on his personal guilt over the false map he sold to the sutler that he had missed the larger, more sinister betrayal orchestrated by his own kin and bylaw. Samuel, the fiercely loyal Virginian, was ruthlessly managing the flow of intelligence, and Elias, the compromised cartographer, was his unwitting tool. Elias now understood the true nature of the cartographer's mistake, his belief that he could control the narrative by controlling the map. He realized he had not been protecting Clara by staying with the South. He had been placing himself directly under the control of the very man who was ruthlessly manipulating events. He quickly reviewed the current sketch for the new crossing point. The 4-foot depth marking, signed off by Samuel, was a lie. Elias knew with the spring thaw approaching, that crossing would be a death trap. It wasn't a mistake. It was a trap, meant to lure federal troops into a surprise attack that would then fail spectacularly due to the depth, creating a false sense of security or a distraction. This was his final, crucial error of allegiance. He had chosen to be the silent accomplice of the South to protect Clara. Now that same Southern leadership was using his work and the lives of men under its command as disposable bait. Elias didn't hesitate. His survival instinct, long dormant, surged back. His path had to change. He could no longer be a pawn in Samuel's game. He took his pen and deliberately marked the 4-foot measurement with a clear, indelible line, scoring it through. He wrote a new depth, 7 feet, unsafe for crossing in thaw. But that was not enough. Then he took a clean sheet of vellum, his most prized, fine-quality mapping paper, and began to draw. He did not draw the Confederate lines. He drew a map of the Union's potential movements, detailing the exact location of the Leesburg Depot, the the size of the company he was currently assigned to, and the false information being fed out by Samuel. He was committing the ultimate act of betrayal, drawing the line between himself and the Confederacy. He would use his one true skill, the absolute truth of the land, to escape. He would find Clara, and together they would vanish. The only way out was across the river, into federal territory. The only way to survive was to offer the one thing that could buy their lives: reliable, accurate intelligence. Elias Thorne, the man who had lost his soul, was about to trade it for freedom. Elias Thorne's existence as a federal intelligence asset was a tightrope walk over an abyss. He operated from the cramped, drafty command post in the Quaker meeting hall, his true identity known only to Colonel Smith and a handful of trusted aides. The blue-gray uniform, the very one that marked him as a Confederate, was his most potent disguise, allowing him to verify intelligence by posing as a captured, compliant Virginia field cartographer. His body surrendered to the chill in early January. He collapsed during a march, waking up days later in a makeshift field hospital, a damp, drafty barn near the town of Manassas. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, pine needles, and the cloying sweetness of gangrene. He was delirious for days, slipping in and out of consciousness. In his fever dreams, he saw the faces of the 3 dead scouts, their blood on the map he had drawn. He saw Clara's eyes, accusing him not of treason, but of self-deception. When the fever broke, he was profoundly weak. A young, inexperienced doctor pressed a piece of stale bread into his hand. "You're lucky, soldier," the doctor muttered, scraping frost from the inside of the barn wall. "Most who get the fever don't see the spring. You'll have a scar to remind you, though." Elias raised a trembling hand to his left cheek. The fever had left its physical mark, a jagged, reddish patch of skin, sensitive and raw, running from his temple to his jawline, a permanent brand, his own personal midwinter's scar. His physical recovery was slow and incomplete. He was no longer just the sickly cartographer. He was the scarred cartographer, marked by both a moral and physical flaw. The true defeat, however, came during his convalescence. While he was recovering, a major, unexpected movement of federal troops occurred along the Potomac. Vance's company, utilizing one of Elias's old, outdated maps that hadn't accounted for the latest troop deployments, was caught in a surprise encirclement. They lost half their men, their wagons, and their best cannon. It was a major defeat for that small section of the Provisional Army. When Vance finally found him, the captain's face was etched with defeat and rage. "Your maps, Thorne," Vance spat, leaning over his cot. "The old maps you drew for Samuel. They were based on old river levels. The Yankees used a crossing you swore was too deep. We lost good men, and all we have to show for it is the mud on our boots." Elias could only stare at the barn ceiling, too weak to defend his old outdated work. The tools of his former trade, his lines, his calculations, his very methods, had turned against him, resulting in defeat and death. He was a failed husband, a failed soldier, and a failed cartographer. He carried the guilt of 3 young men he killed with a lie, and the responsibility for a dozen more lost by his out-of-date truth. Lying there in the darkness, feeling the throbbing burn of the scar on his face, Elias realized he was completely isolated. The North viewed him as a traitor. The South viewed him as a flawed asset, his work unreliable. And Clara, though protected, was emotionally distant. His only companions were the specters of the dead and the bitter cold of a war that had just begun. Elias Thorne was discharged from the Manassas Field Hospital in late January 1861, his face bearing the permanent reddish brand of the fever, his midwinter scar. He was officially reassigned, not back to Captain Vance's company, but to a logistics outpost near Leesburg, closer to the Potomac border. His orders were simple: use his expertise to verify and update old military boundary maps, ensuring future troop movements would not repeat the costly errors of the past. The work was tedious and solitary, spent poring over brittle, decade-old land surveys. It was in this cold isolation that Elias began to truly confront the cumulative weight of his choices. He was paid in depreciated Confederate currency, haunted by the dead, and separated from Clara, who remained at Oak Hill, guarded by Samuel. The turning point came one desolate afternoon, while Elias was cross-referencing a 1785 French survey with a recent crudely drawn Confederate sketch of the Potomac's riverbanks. The sketch, intended to show a secure crossing point for future raids into Maryland, was marked with a precise measurement for the river's depth, 4 feet. He frowned, pulling out his own meticulous river soundings taken years earlier for a commercial project. The Potomac's currents were notoriously fickle, constantly shifting the sediment. A depth of 4 feet in summer could easily be 6 or 7 feet in the thaw of spring. He flipped the sketch over, and his breath hitched. Scrawled on the back in faint pencil were a series of initials and dates. Among them were the initials SP, Samuel Pritchard, and a date from late December, followed by the single word, assured. A cold, sharp clarity cut through the fever-induced fog of Elias's guilt. The realization hit him that Samuel hadn't simply asked him to draw better maps. He had used the outdated map mistake not as a justification for a tactical error, but as a deliberate shield. The Union pickets that annihilated Vance's company had been alerted by Samuel. The mistake was a calculated sacrifice of Vance's men, all expendable border militia, to protect a more vital intelligence operation. Samuel was clearing his own field of play. Elias had been so focused on his personal guilt over the false map he sold to the sutler that he had missed the larger, more sinister betrayal orchestrated by his own kin and bylaw. Samuel, the fiercely loyal Virginian, was ruthlessly managing the flow of intelligence, and Elias, the compromised cartographer, was his unwitting tool. Elias now understood the true nature of the cartographer's mistake, his belief that he could control the narrative by controlling the map. He realized he had not been protecting Clara by staying with the South. He had been placing himself directly under the control of the very man who was ruthlessly manipulating events. He quickly reviewed the current sketch for the new crossing point. The 4-foot depth marking, signed off by Samuel, was a lie. Elias knew with the spring thaw approaching, that crossing would be a death trap. It wasn't a mistake. It was a trap, meant to lure federal troops into a surprise attack that would then fail spectacularly due to the depth, creating a false sense of security or a distraction. This was his final, crucial error of allegiance. He had chosen to be the silent accomplice of the South to protect Clara. Now that same Southern leadership was using his work and the lives of men under its command as disposable bait. Elias didn't hesitate. His survival instinct, long dormant, surged back. His path had to change. He could no longer be a pawn in Samuel's game. He took his pen and deliberately marked the 4-foot measurement with a clear, indelible line, scoring it through. He wrote a new depth, 7 feet, unsafe for crossing in thaw. But that was not enough. Then he took a clean sheet of vellum, his most prized, fine-quality mapping paper, and began to draw. He did not draw the Confederate lines. He drew a map of the Union's potential movements, detailing the exact location of the Leesburg depot, the size of the company he was currently assigned to, and the false information being fed out by Samuel. He was committing the ultimate act of betrayal, drawing the line between himself and the Confederacy. He would use his one true skill, the absolute truth of the land, to escape. He would find Clara, and together they would vanish. The only way out was across the river, into federal territory. The only way to survive was to offer the one thing that could buy their lives: reliable, accurate intelligence. Elias Thorne, the man who had lost his soul, was about to trade it for freedom. Elias Thorne's existence as a federal intelligence asset was a tightrope walk over an abyss. He operated from the cramped, drafty command post in the Quaker meeting hall, his true identity known only to Colonel Smith and a handful of trusted aides. The blue-gray uniform, the very one that marked him as a Confederate, was his most potent disguise, allowing him to verify intelligence by posing as a captured, compliant Virginia field cartographer.
We? Clara asked, picking up the map and instantly recognizing the Federal troop movements, her mind sharp and tactical. Elias, I can't leave my home simply because of a skirmish. You betrayed my kin. I betrayed the cause, Clara, to save you. The war is coming here because of Samuel's manipulations. He sacrificed Billy's unit to protect a larger secret. He will sacrifice you next. He pointed to the Federal lines on the map. If you stay, you are captured or killed. If you come with me, we vanish. We find that small piece of neutral ground we always spoke of, where the lines on the map don't matter. Clara looked from the map to Elias's scarred, pleading face, and finally to the window, where the first hint of morning light was visible. The choice was agonizing, but stark. She grabbed her carpet bag. "Where are we going, Elias?" she asked, her voice steady now. "West," he said, pulling her toward the back door, toward the dust-covered fields. West to where the war hasn't finished drawing its lines, to the only true deliverance left. They mounted the horse and rode out just as the first distant sound of cannon fire echoed through the valley. They were leaving the heart of the conflict, fleeing their past and their compromises, heading toward an unknown sanctuary on the frontier. They were not seeking peace, but a new, terrible kind of freedom. The escape from Oak Hill was a harrowing success, a rush of dust and deliverance that carried Elias and Clara away from the immediate threat of war. They rode west for 2 weeks, following old frontier trails, Elias's compass his only reliable guide in a world stripped of its certainties. They were 2 fugitives, husband and wife, united by desperation, but separated by an unspoken chasm of guilt and moral compromise. Their money dwindled rapidly. They traded Clara's last few pieces of jewelry for passage on a flatboat heading down the Tennessee River. Elias discarded his blue-gray uniform, trading it for the rough, anonymous clothes of a river worker. His midwinter scar and his deep-set eyes were the only testament to his past. Their journey brought them, by chance, to the small, muddy landing near Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, in early April 1862. The air was thick with tension, not the political tension of the border, but the imminent, palpable threat of mass warfare. Elias had intended to secure passage further west, across the Mississippi, but the river was choked with troop transports and supply barges. Federal troops, thousands of them, were encamped along the bank and in the surrounding woods. They disembarked and found themselves walking toward a small, weather-beaten log structure atop a gentle rise, a Methodist meeting house known locally as Shiloh Church. The church and the surrounding open fields, usually quiet and pastoral, were eerily alive. Tents dotted the landscape, campfires smoked. Soldiers joked and played cards, unaware of the slaughter that awaited them just beyond the horizon. Yet to Elias, the place already felt haunted. They were seeking food and a place to rest when Elias led Clara into the churchyard. He wasn't religious, but the solitude of the ancient oaks offered a moment of respite. As they sat on a low, crumbling stone wall, Elias pulled out his small, worn cartographer's compass. He spun the needle and watched it settle, pointing relentlessly north. "It still points to where I came from, Clara," he murmured, his voice heavy. "But I can't go back. The cost is too high." Clara leaned her head against the cool stone of the wall. "It points north, Elias, but the war is here. This ground, it feels restless." He stood up, his cartographer's instinct overriding his need for rest. He climbed the highest ground near the church. From there, he scanned the landscape. The Federal camp was spread out haphazardly, overconfident and lacking proper defensive lines. Suddenly, his eyes, trained to read terrain and movement, registered a deep, chilling truth. Beyond the federal perimeter, far out in the dense woods to the south and west, the silence was too complete. The air felt heavy, pressed down by an enormous, unseen presence. The enemy is not far, Elias thought, a cold sweat breaking out despite the chill. They are waiting, preparing a colossal surprise. He was looking at a map that hadn't been drawn yet, a battle that hadn't been fought. He was standing on the precipice of one of the war's bloodiest encounters. He descended quickly, finding Clara still resting. "We have to leave now, Clara," he urged, grabbing her arm. "The war is about to happen here. This isn't a skirmish. This is a reckoning." "We're safe here, Elias. It's a federal camp," she protested, confused by his urgency. "It's a trap, Clara. They are too exposed. I've seen the silence. I've felt the weight of the woods. There are thousands of men out there waiting for dawn." He looked back at the small, lonely church, a peaceful sanctuary poised to become a hellscape. He saw the future in the stillness, the fields sown with bodies, the gentle slopes running red. The ghosts were not coming. They were already settling in the silence before the storm. Elias realized that his deliverance from Samuel's direct control was not an escape from the war, but a relocation to its center. He couldn't warn the federal command. He was a suspected Confederate deserter and a known intelligence asset. His word was worthless. They fled the churchyard just as night fell, the sounds of distant axes and low voices from the surrounding woods confirming Elias's fears. They were the last civilians to leave that ground. As they rode away in a commandeered wagon, Elias looked back at the dark outline of the church. The peaceful structure, framed against the gathering darkness, already carried the indelible mark of what was to come. The ghosts of Shiloh Church were the millions of men who would fight and die, fulfilling the prophecy of the war Elias had tried so hard to outrun. Elias and Clara's flight from Pittsburgh Landing was a desperate, panicked retreat. They moved southwestward through the thick woods, the first cannon blasts of the Battle of Shiloh acting as a horrifying soundtrack to their escape. For 2 days, the air was heavy with the distant rolling thunder of artillery and the crackle of musket fire, the very reckoning Elias had sensed at the church. They found precarious refuge in a deserted, isolated trapper's cabin 5 miles from the battlefield. From their hidden vantage point, the smoke-filled sky and the ceaseless noise made it impossible to ignore the violence they had barely outrun. It was during the brief lull after the first day of fighting that Elias finally succumbed to the crushing weight of his grief and guilt. Clara was sleeping, exhausted, on a pile of straw. Elias sat by the cold hearth, tracing the edges of his midwinter scar. The silence of the cabin, contrasting sharply with the terrifying chaos outside, amplified the reflection on the past. His mind went back, not to the grand scale of the war, but to the single, devastating act that had fractured his life: the death of Billy Pritchard. He saw the boy's face, not frozen in death, but alive and accusing him near the icy stream. "The line! You drew the line!" Billy's words were the true ghost of Shiloh Church. This cataclysmic battle, this mass slaughter unfolding miles away, was merely the amplification of that single, personal act of violence. Elias had sacrificed a life to save his own freedom and Clara's safety, and the consequence was not peace, but a direct entanglement with the war's brutality.
His moral failure wasn't just in choosing a side he didn't believe in. It was in choosing to value his personal comfort, his marriage, over the universal truth of human life. He realized the cartographer's mistake wasn't just an error on a map. It was the fundamental error of believing one could map out morality. Clara stirred, her eyes opening. She saw the anguish on Elias's face and came to sit beside him, wrapping a thin blanket around his shoulders. "It will stop, Elias," she whispered, her voice strained. "It won't, Clara. This place is just a symbol. This entire valley, the whole country, it's all just Shiloh now.
It's all paid for by lies and sacrifices. My lie killed Billy. Samuel's lie killed those men near Winchester. The war feeds on personal compromises. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his compass. It had been his one constant, always pointing true north. He held it out to Clara. The war started at my home, at Harper's Ferry, when I chose secrecy over truth, when I used my skill to serve a shadow. The only way to survive now is to stop running from the guilt and instead run with the purpose. Clara took the compass, her fingers brushing his scarred cheek. She didn't offer comfort, she offered a stark challenge, reflecting the hardened survivalist she had become. And what is the purpose, Elias? More maps? More betrayal? The purpose is the only line I can draw now that is true, to stop Samuel, Elias declared, his eyes blazing with a fierce resolve born of grief. He engineered that defeat at Winchester and Billy's death to eliminate threats and consolidate his power. He is not fighting for the South, he is fighting for himself. He is a cancer, and he knows my weaknesses. I am the only one who can stop him. The moment was a painful act of grief and reflection, leading to a radical, final commitment. Elias realized his path wasn't to escape the war's lines, but to actively draw the last one, the one that defined his final allegiance. He would use the remaining federal intelligence he possessed to track Samuel, forcing a confrontation that would either lead to his own death or to the liberation of his life from Samuel's shadow. Their flight from the ghosts of Shiloh Church was not over. It was merely changing direction, turning back toward the original source of the conflict. He took the compass back and pointed its needle not north or west, but east, back toward Virginia, back toward Samuel. The fierce resolution forged amidst the horror of Shiloh Church led Elias and Clara not west to a sanctuary, but south and east, back toward the war-ravaged Shenandoah Valley. Elias's goal was clear: neutralize Samuel, Pritchard, the architect of his misery and the man who personified the war's deceit. The final confrontation was not a military battle, but a grim, silent ambush at a dusty rail junction in North Carolina, where Samuel was overseeing the transfer of critically needed Confederate munitions. Using the remnants of his federal intelligence and Clara's knowledge of her cousin's predictable ruthlessness, Elias intercepted him. There were no witnesses. Samuel, cornered and realizing the extent of Elias's betrayal, attempted to draw a pistol. Elias, anticipating the move, struck first. The struggle was brief and brutal, ending not with a gunshot, but with the cold, final certainty of a knife. A necessary, terrible act that severed the last toxic thread connecting Elias to the Confederacy and his past compromises. The act was his ultimate payment for Billy's death and his own guilt. He took nothing from the scene, leaving Samuel to the judgment of the war he had helped inflame. Clara and Elias immediately turned their backs on the smoking ruins of the Eastern conflict. They traveled relentlessly, heading for the true West, the prairies of Kansas, a territory still raw and unsettled, where the lines on the map were drawn by surveyors, not generals. Their chosen destination was a small settlement near the Kansas-Colorado border, a place barely marked on any existing map, offering the anonymity of hard labor and the clean slate of unforgiving land. Their arrival in the late summer of 1863 was not triumphant, but painfully quiet. They settled into a sod house, a crude dwelling built into the earth, the antithesis of the stone and timber of Harper's Ferry and Oak Hill. This was the start of their new life, built from the very dust they had ridden through. The immediate aftermath was one of rebuilding, both physical and marital. Elias used his hands for practical work, plowing the tough prairie grass, building a timber frame addition, and digging a well. He spent his days fighting the land, not the armies, and the struggle was an unexpected therapy. His midwinter scar was now just another imperfection, hidden beneath the dust and sunburned skin of a farmer. Clara, stripped of her gentry status, found a quiet strength she never knew she possessed. She tended the small garden, learned to manage the scant resources, and found a grim peace in the labor. The immense unspoken gulf between them, the shadow of Billy, the betrayal of Samuel, slowly began to close, not through forgiveness, but through shared, difficult survival.
One evening, nearly a year after their arrival, Elias sat outside, cleaning his old cartographer's tools. He picked up his compass, the needle still pointing faithfully north, though he was thousands of miles from his childhood home. Clara came out and sat beside him. She reached out and touched the compass, the object that had defined his entire journey. "Are you still drawing lines, Elias?" she asked softly. He looked at the compass, then out across the vast rolling prairie, a land without boundaries, where the horizon was the only limit. "I am not drawing lines, Clara," he said, closing the case. "I am forging a frontier. Not just here," he gestured to the land, "but here," and he tapped his chest. "A life where the only loyalty that matters is the truth between us, and the only map we follow is the one we build together." The war raged on thousands of miles away, but here it was only an occasional headline in a month-old newspaper. Elias Thorne, the reluctant spy and compromised cartographer, had found his ultimate deliverance in the anonymity and the honesty of the frontier. They were survivors, their life a testament to the fact that rebuilding morality, like rebuilding a home, starts with the foundation of truth, no matter how harsh the ground. Their legacy would be not in the history books of the war, but in the small, arduous act of starting anew. The harsh plains of Kansas were the crucible of Elias and Clara Thorne's redemption. They survived the first brutal winter by relying on the skills born of desperation. Elias's engineering mind applied to irrigation, and Clara's refined management skills adapted to the economics of subsistence farming. They had traded the deadly politics of the East for the honest, brutal negotiations with the weather and the soil. 2 years after their arrival, the war back east finally ended. The news reached their remote settlement slowly, carried on the worn pages of distant newspapers. When Elias read of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, he felt not elation, but a profound, weary stillness. The massive conflict that had destroyed his former life was over, yet the ghosts, Billy, the young scouts, the betrayal of Samuel, remained. Their ultimate fate was defined by their choice to stay. They built a sturdy clapboard house on the prairie, a structure that owed nothing to the architecture of Virginia or the idealism of New England. It was a testament to their own hard-won neutrality. Their family began anew, far from the battle lines. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, was born in the spring of 1866. Holding her, Elias finally understood the true value of the new frontier. It wasn't just physical land, it was the ability to rewrite the family's narrative, to forge a legacy unburdened by the specific sins of the Civil War. Elias never picked up a military map again. He found his true calling in the prosaic, necessary work of settling the West. He became the local surveyor, mapping the quarter sections for the homesteaders arriving in the territory. His maps were meticulously accurate, defining boundaries not for battle, but for building. He was known not as the compromised spy or the Southern trader, but simply as Thorne, the man who knew the land. Clara, meanwhile, became the settlement's unofficial historian and educator. She taught the children to read, telling them stories of America's past, carefully omitting the dark years of her own experience and Samuel's cruel manipulations. She was, in her own quiet way, ensuring that the legacy passed down was one of resilience and self-reliance, not bitterness or sectional hatred. Elias's ultimate fate was not fame or power, but a deep, quiet peace. He lived out his days as a pillar of his small community, a man whose hands bore the calluses of a farmer and whose mind dealt only in the measurable truths of geology and latitude. The midwinter's scar on his cheek remained, a permanent, private reminder of the price of his moral compromises. The story's lasting historical impact, however, was unwritten and entirely unseen by the grand sweep of history. It lay in two distinct areas: the unseen shift in border defense. The federal forces, utilizing Elias's early accurate intelligence about Samuel Pritchard's deceptions, were able to significantly neutralize Confederate covert operations in the Shenandoah Valley in the critical early years of the war. Elias's maps and his timely defection likely saved hundreds of federal lives and crippled a key logistical artery for the South. This pivotal shift was never attributed to him. It remained a successful anonymous intelligence coup known only to a few long-dead military officers. The erased family history. The Thorne-Pritchard legacy of conflict and division was intentionally eradicated on the Kansas prairie. Elias and Clara never spoke of the war to Hope. The memory of Billy and the villainy of Samuel were buried, ensuring that the next generation inherited only the frontier's promise and not the East's poison. Elias died peacefully in his own bed in 1898, Clara passing quietly a few years later. His name appears nowhere in the official war records of either the Union or the Confederacy. His legacy was not etched in stone or military honor, but in the straight, true lines of his property surveys that defined the lives of his neighbors, and in the unwritten narrative of a man who ultimately found his moral compass by putting down his weapons and picking up his tools, choosing the slow, hard work of forging a new frontier over the easy path of forgetting the past. He was a ghost of the war, finally finding his resting place in the land he helped define.
If you're still awake, another peaceful story awaits you.